What's up, guys? In this video I'm going to be talking about the top myths about green tree pythons. Alright, so it's 2019 and we still have a lot of myths surrounding chondros. A lot of people have a lot of misconceptions about them as far as their care and overall their disposition and stuff. So I want to break down some of the myths. So the biggest one I think people think about green tree pythons when they first hear about them or first looking into them is that they're a difficult species to care for. In all honesty, and I tell people this all the time, if you give them what they need, these are probably one of the easiest species to keep. It's just a matter of making sure they have what you need to give them. If you give them the proper setup with the proper heat, you're not going to have many issues. These things are freaking food hounds. They would eat every day if you'd let them. They don't need a ton of humidity depending on what part of the country you're in. And they're overall, they're not hard snakes to keep. So another misconception about them is that they are feisty. And while this is true with a lot of the Beox, well, I won't say it's true with a lot of the Beox, but a majority of the Beox localities, they do have kind of an attitude problem and they are a little feistier than what you would normally see with some other localities. It kind of varies from animal to animal though, because not all Beox are complete monsters, and not all Arus or Manoquaris or Sarongs or Jayapuras are all puppy dog tame. It really depends on the animal. I have my big Beox female. I can pull her out no problem and handle her. Getting her out is kind of a nightmare because she's looking for food. My male, on the other hand, he's horrible. All he wants to do is bite me. I have these little guys though. They don't care for the most part. This is one of the babies from Luke Myers. This one's a little more chill than its sibling. So as you can see, not biting me, hanging out, no big deal. And so this brings me to the next myth, is that green tree pythons shouldn't be handled. And while it is a species that I wouldn't necessarily say is one that I'd handle on a daily basis, as you can see I'm handling this one and it's not giving me any problems. Granted, the size does matter because I'm obviously not going to go and hold, focus. I don't handle these little babies here. I won't focus, whatever. So obviously at this size they're pretty fragile, so I'm not going to be handling those on a daily basis. But when they get a little older, this snake's actually just over a year old as of a couple days ago. It's a little bigger, the bone structure is a little more well developed as far as the vertebrae and stuff in the tail, and I'm not going to have as many issues. But still, even with the adults, it's not a species I really play with all that much. They do tolerate handling, but if you talk to any of the old school guys in chondros, they're going to tell you that stress is probably the #1 killer of green trees over anything else. You can handle them, it just needs to be in smaller doses, and they're definitely not an animal to do like school talks with or something unless they're in a cage hanging out. Not something you want to give kids because their teeth are pretty gnarly. And so then the next misconception is going to be that these guys need to be kept crazy humid. This is going to kind of depend on what part of the country you're in. If you're in Arizona or the more arid parts of the country, you're probably going to have more issues with humidity than someone like me here in the southeast, where I don't have many humidity issues at all. In all reality, I only missed any of mine, even the babies, which that's kind of a different story. I miss them maybe once or twice a week, but I don't keep them very wet or humid. The only time I missed any of my chondros is when they're in a shed cycle, and it's mostly because they're not really meant to be kept wet. When it's raining in the wild, they're trying to get away from that rain by taking cover. They don't enjoy sitting in it. It's not something they particularly like when you spray them, and you can tell because they curl up into a tighter coil when you hit them with water. So they're not really meant to be kept super wet, and they do fine. I rarely have shed issues. Like I said, when they do go into a shed cycle, I do miss them a little more than I normally would, but the thing with shedding is it's much less of a humidity issue, much more of a hydration issue, which is an entirely different topic. But if you keep these guys hydrated and give them fresh water on a regular basis, you're probably not going to have any problems. What else? One of the other misconceptions that we hear a lot is that you need to keep these guys on the hotter end of things. In all reality, they're a nocturnal snake, and when they're active at night, obviously the daytime temperatures the temperatures in general really aren't even that hot compared to during the day. These guys are active at night, which is going to be the cooler part of the 24-hour period in a day. So keeping these guys in the high 80s probably isn't doing anything good for them, considering Papua New Guinea really doesn't even get that hot. You can give these guys a little bit cooler temperatures, and they're probably actually going to do better, especially adults. Small ones like this and like the red neonates like I have, I keep them at about 86 consistently, and they do fine. But adults definitely seem to do better being kept at slightly cooler temperatures. Another misconception, that green tree pythons are hard to breed. And I can't really speak on this too much because I've only produced one clutch of these guys, but I can tell you that getting the eggs out of the pair was probably the easiest part of the whole thing. Getting the babies to eat their first meal is the really difficult part. They're so small. When they're babies, they occupy a completely different habitat as the adults, and they actually have a completely different diet as the adults. So when they're small, like the little red neonate I just showed you, their primary diet in the wild is going to be skinks and small lizards, sometimes even bugs. And then as they get older and they start transitioning and their color change happens, their habitat shifts and they're actually moving more into the forest as opposed to being on the forest line as babies. And then their dietary habits shift to more mammalian and warm-blooded prey. So when we try to feed pinkies to these babies, that's kind of trying to fit a square peg in the circle hole, and it's not really kind of what they're meant to be eating on. So a lot of times babies need to be, the mice need to be scented. They're a real pain. So that is the hardest part of breeding, is getting the babies to eat, but getting the eggs really isn't that difficult. Getting them to breed really isn't that difficult either. It's definitely not a species that I would recommend if someone's looking to breed anything for the first time. Green trees probably aren't it. I'd probably go with something a little more forgiving. The eggs are pretty delicate. I mean, my experience with it was fairly smooth from egg laying to hatching, but still nerve-wracking. They're cool snakes, the eggs are delicate, and if you're gonna breed them, at least keep the species for a little while before you give breeding a shot. You know, get some time with them and learn them. Here, I'll move a little closer. I don't think you can get this in shot still. A big part of where a lot of these myths and misconceptions come from is a lot of information that we kind of got in the early days of chondro keeping. A lot of the sort of misconceptions about having to keep them super humid and keep them warm and all that stuff are all just a product of the early days of keeping this species and what we noticed worked for probably some really sick snakes. A lot of imports come in with a heavy parasite load, dehydrated, and with, you know, endless amounts of other issues. But now in 2019, even earlier than that, we're learning that these snakes really aren't that difficult to keep and they're really not that difficult to breed. It's just a matter of giving them what they need and knowing they're not as forgiving as, you know, your run-of-the-mill corn snake or carpet python are going to be. If you give them what they need, you're not going to have any problems with them. But if you cut corners and you try to do things the cheap way, you're probably the cards are stacked against you, so to speak. Exoterras can work for this species. I don't recommend them. It's going to be more of a hassle and more of a pain to get exoterras to work with green tree pythons than it will just bucking up the money and buying a PVC, or if they're young like this one's in a rack with the babies. But I have some tub setups that work just as well. But if you're looking for something that looks good and you want to do the naturalistic Vivaria, which is fine too, if that's what you want to do, that's what you want to do. Just know getting sort of the parameters of their care is a little more difficult in aquariums and exoterras than it is in a plastic tub setup. And also, if you want to make your life a lot easier when getting into green tree pythons, buy a captive bred snake. There's nothing wrong with imports. I'm not against imports. I own imports. But those are usually probably best left to the people that are prepared to deal with the medical necessities of a fresh import that's going to have a heavy parasite load and going to have problems. Not that it's not something someone who wants to get into green trees can't accomplish. If they're prepared to do that and they're prepared to spend the money, go for it, do it. But a lot of people who buy them on impulse, buy imported animals, and then, you know, a month later, whatever, the animal dies, and then they get all frustrated and they want to find out who the seller was and crucify them when likely it was probably something on their end, unfortunately. But if you've seen them online anywhere for sale, you know they're not cheap snakes. You know that you can see imports that are, you know, imported Biocs are usually around the $375 mark from importers, and that a lot of that pricing kind of lures people into thinking that they're getting a deal. If you think about it, by the time you pay for the vet bill, pay for any medicines or any treatments, pay for a good setup, you end up spending the same amount that you would on a captive bred snake, where you probably wouldn't have had to do any of that. You might as well go ahead and fork over the extra money to buy a captive bred animal over an import and save yourself the pain and heartache, because these are really cool snakes, and it sucks when people buy them on impulse and then just have a run of bad luck with them when they could have saved themselves that. And instead of being in a rush to buy the animal, could have got something really nice that would do well for them. Because once these guys get going, they're strong. They're super easy to keep. They feed like crazy. I will also say, if you're looking for a snake that's exciting and actually kind of out and about a lot, that's moving around, kind of like the Brettles pythons, which you guys know I'm a huge fan of, then green trees aren't the snake for you. Honestly, all day, all these guys do is sleep. They stay curled up. They don't really do much, which I guess is cool because you always get to see them. Like, since they perch exclusively, they're never hiding, so it's not like you don't get to see them. But if you want a snake that moves around and does stuff, you know, like I said, like the Brettles pythons or any carpet python for that matter, green trees aren't going to offer that. They're pretty much just going to stay in the same place during the day, and then at night they'll cruise. But for a display animal, I mean, they are gorgeous. There's no denying it. The yellows are pretty, the reds are pretty. They're great display animals. I should also mention, there's 2 books that you can pick up that are going to be good information for keeping the species and getting into them. That'll teach you pretty much everything you need to know. Let's see if I can get this thing to focus. The More Complete Chondro from Greg Maxwell. This was like the original book on green trees. This one was published in 2005, so this one is a little bit dated as far as the information goes, if you ask me. There's still plenty of great information in here. Some of the numbers and some of the stats as far as care and sort of how we're keeping them now have changed a little bit since this was published, but it is still very much relevant. It is still very much worth picking up. The other one that's more recent is from Justin Julander and Terry Phillip, and this is Green Tree Pythons, Natural History and Captive Maintenance. This is a newer book. Like I said, this one came out in 2017. So we're only 2 years out from this one being published. This one has field studies in it. It talks about all the things we're doing wrong with keeping this species. People ask me which book they should get, and I tell them, just pay the money and get both. This one has very relevant information in it still, the more recent information I should say, and then this one still has very much relevant information in it too. So instead of choosing one over the other, if you get both, you're going to have your bases pretty well covered. Check both of these out. If I can find them on Amazon, I'll leave a link in the description as well. But I hope this video was helpful. I'm planning on hopefully doing sort of a video series on like complete front to back, getting into green trees, captive bred versus imports, setups, what the best thing is to do for those, what I do for feeding, hydration, all that stuff. I'm thinking about doing a video series. As always, if you have any questions, leave them in the comments. I try to be pretty quick about responding. Please subscribe. Give this video a like if you liked it. Check out my podcast that I do on green trees. It's called the Chondro Cast. It's the podcast about green tree pythons and the people that keep them. It's a podcast exclusive to these guys. I get some of the best in the hobby, talking about them, how they care for them, breeding, all that good stuff. It's a nice wealth of information. So check that out. I'll leave a link in the description. Follow it on Facebook and on Instagram. It's at the Chondro Cast on both platforms. Follow me at Palmetto Coast Exotics on all platforms. And we'll see you later.